Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the beta preview build of Sniper Ghost Warrior 3. This is an upcoming first-person shooter developed by CI Games, or City Interactive if you prefer their full name, and it's scheduled to be released on April 4th of this year. I was given a preview of the beta version, which is basically a demo. It's a cut-down version of what you would experience in the full version of the game. There's some degree of the open world there, there's a couple of missions you can mess around with, a few weapons you can mess around with, and of course some gadgets that you can mess around with. But I'll get to that stuff more in a moment. Something you need to keep in mind here is that this is a beta preview build. It's not the final release of the game, it's not even a final demo of the game. There's still 2 months until this game gets released, so there's definitely the opportunity for them to change a fair bit of things. Granted, they're not going to be able to change the core gameplay all that much, but they should be able to iron out at least some of the technical problems that I experienced throughout the course of this beta by the time that the full game comes out. But then the question becomes, will that be enough? Well, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out exactly what we're dealing with here. Presentation-wise, this runs on the CryEngine, and it has both really good and really awful effects in it. The lighting effects, the modeling, and the environmental design are generally extremely well done. The problems start to come in when you look at just about everything else. The animations are merely average at best, although a lot of them are absolutely plagued by glitches right now, so that's really not helping things. I mean, when you look at the bolt cycling animations, they'll move their hand and then the bolt moves after they've moved their hand. It looks terrible. Of course, I'm confident that's just a glitch and that they'll be able to sort that out by the time the game comes out, but it really doesn't do wonders for the presentation here. Similarly, the textures go all over the place. Some of them are rather good and other ones are downright terrible. But most of them are somewhere in the middle. Now keep in mind, I am playing this on the high settings because they haven't finished up the optimizations yet and it doesn't really run at 60 FPS if I run it on the absolute max. That said, most of the changes between the high and ultra settings are just in the post-processing side of things. This of course does improve the visual quality a bit, but it's not really a substantial increase, or certainly not substantial enough to justify the loss in performance. But ultimately what really takes the cake as far as the presentation goes is the FOV and the motion blur, and one particular effect whenever you use the scouting drone. You see, this thing runs at a pretty low FOV. I think it's somewhere between 60 and 65. It's kind of hard to be sure without an exact number in the config files or anything. But it's definitely low enough to have an effect. When you combine that with the ridiculously strong motion blur to the point where it's some of the worst motion blur I've seen in a game in quite a long time, this is a recipe for Puke City. And if that weren't enough, whenever you use the scouting drone, it has this really strong fisheye lens effect going on that makes things even worse when you combine it with the motion blur and the FOV. These issues could be relatively easily remedied. First off, give us an option to turn off the motion blur. Yes, you heard me right. There is no option to turn off the motion blur in this game. At all. There is also no option to raise the FOV any higher than what they currently have it set to. So I hope you keep a bucket nearby because you're gonna need it to puke into if you play this thing. These are all things that could definitely be fixed. Toss in an FOV slider, toss in the option to turn off the motion blur, and put in an option to disable the fisheye effect when you use the scout drone. Because otherwise you're basically extending your middle finger to anyone who is affected by low FOVs, or especially low FOVs and motion blur. And hell, after I finished recording the footage for this video, I actually had a really hard time not throwing up and not falling over because I was suffering from a mild form of vertigo. This is why motion blur toggles are a thing. This is why FOV sliders are a thing. It's not because we want some advantage, it's not because we're PC elitists or whatever, it's because we don't want to suffer from motion sickness while playing our damn video games. Anyway, moving on from the mini rant, we go over to the sound design, where the weapon sounds are pretty wimpy for the most part. Not enough bass, all of the suppressors sound like generic movie suppressors, which makes them sound ridiculous. Explosions aren't anywhere near beefy enough, it's really disappointing. Voice acting is relatively limited in this beta, but all of the characters speak English, which makes them sound kind of goofy, because you have your Americans that you're playing as, who put in sufficient but otherwise unremarkable performances, and then you have all of the antagonists, who I think are supposed to be from the Balkan region. I'm not 100% sure. But then again, I'm making an educated guess given all of the Cyrillic all over the place, as well as the former Soviet bloc structures and everything like that. Regardless of where they are actually from, they basically sound like movie villains putting on really goofy accents, and it just sounds awful. Hopefully in the full game, they'll give us the option to keep those voices as native and just have the subtitles take over. But we'll just have to wait and see on that. Then you move over into the music, which there really isn't that much of in this particular beta. There's a couple of songs that sound like folk music, but I'm not 100% sure on that because I don't have access to the track listing or the artists that did them or anything like that, and I don't even know what language they're sung in, so that doesn't help either. But they don't really last very long. You've got one playing during the menu, and then you've got another one playing during the intro sequence, and beyond that, you're dealing with some music that if it even exists, it just fades completely into the background and is completely unnoticeable. So overall, the sound design doesn't really help it out too much. But then we move over into what really matter here, which are story, which there really isn't any in the beta, so I'm not going to talk about that, and gameplay. There are two missions in the beta. One of them is to take out a specific target, and the other one is to infiltrate a location and upload signals to satellites. And both of these basically consist of doing the exact same thing, which is scout the area, mostly using your scouting drone, and find out where all the enemies are and figure out a way to take them all out or avoid them entirely, and then complete your objective and get out of there. To that end, the game gives you 3 sniper rifles, 2 assault rifles, a shotgun, and 2 pistols to mess around with as far as your weapons go, and then you have the various gadgets that you can use as well. Of course, you have your scouting drone, but you also have the things like the landmines, or grenades, or throwing knives, or things like that that you can set up traps with, or just try to annihilate large groups of enemies with. The thing is that the amount of ammo you can carry is rather limited, so going into full-on engagements is generally not a particularly good idea, especially since you are very, very squishy. You really can't take all that much damage before going down, and even worse than that, you can't even really tell how much damage you're taking at any given point. I mean, sure, your screen turns red when you get hit, but you don't really get an indication of how much damage that shot did to you. The only way you can tell for sure is by keeping an eye on the health meter, which is down in the bottom right of the screen, tucked out of the way and something you're not really going to be paying too much attention to in the middle of a firefight. It also doesn't regenerate, so you have to use health items to restore your health, things like hypos or medkits and such like that that you can use to replenish different amounts of bars of health. And you'll be using those quite a lot because, like I said, your character is really squishy. Granted, you are playing as a sniper and not some hulking brute who can just charge in guns blazing. The idea is you're supposed to sneak into the area, then get into position, take out the one target you need to take out, and then get out of there without anybody being the wiser. This is a lot easier said than done, for 2 major reasons. The first of them being that not every situation is really ideal for you to sneak in and out and not be noticed. Second being, the AI in this game is really dumb. But it's not just that it's dumb, it's that it's wildly inconsistent. There are times that I've been sitting there well within their field of vision. In fact, they've been looking straight at me. I haven't had any cover around me or anything, so it's not like I'm hidden from view, and they still didn't notice me. Other times, they've spotted me from a half a mile away when I'm just crawling through some bushes. It just makes no sense. Of course, what's even more funny is when you sneak into an area and then start interrogating one guy, and there's another guy right next to him who doesn't notice. I mean, seriously, look at this crap.
Talk, or I break you.
Our resources are right there.
Pretty ridiculous, isn't it? Well, at the same time, you could shoot somebody halfway across the map and his buddies will notice and then that will raise the alarm and you're just sitting there going, wait a minute, what just happened? Like I said, there's not really that much consistency to the AI, which is what ultimately makes it problematic. Sometimes they'll follow you to the ends of the earth, sometimes they'll hunker down, and there doesn't really seem to be much rhyme or reason to why they'll do either. So that's something that CI is definitely going to need to sort out by the time the game finally launches. They're also going to need to sort out the rather ridiculous amount of technical problems that I encountered throughout the course of this beta. It's actually kind of funny because they made a notice at the very beginning of the beta that says, "This is a preview beta build. You may experience some slight glitches here and there." Yes, slight glitches, like the sudden disappearance of my money after I reloaded a checkpoint and thus tried to re-buy all the stuff that I had purchased, only to find that I had no money to purchase it with. Or the really annoying glitch where it kept replacing my M9 with a 45, which I didn't have any ammo for, so I had basically one magazine's worth of 45 ammo, and then I ended up with an empty 45 and an empty assault rifle because I had run out of ammo for that too, and I ended up just basically going around doing takedowns and trying to snipe as much as I could with that. Or how about the really fun game-breaking glitch where it went to interact with a particular objective and it didn't stop interacting with that particular objective and let me continue the mission. Yes, these are all clearly slight glitches and not things that constantly kept popping up and irritating the hell out of me while I was trying to mess with this thing. Don't get me wrong, they'll probably sort those bugs out by launch too, but it doesn't make them any less irritating. There is clearly a fair bit of optimization and bug fixing to do, which they definitely still have time for. I mean, it is still 2 months out. They have time to implement fixes from this beta. What I don't think they have time to fix is the core gameplay, which is pretty much just if you took the modern Far Cry style of open world game and then you just slapped some extra sniping mechanics on it. Yes, this time it's an open world game, and there's a bunch of outposts that have a bunch of enemies at them, and you can expect heavy resistance in those locations. There is a crafting system in this thing, which involves you grabbing a bunch of materials and then using them to craft bullets or grenades or anything like that. Various tools that will help you out on your journey. There's an in-game currency that you earn by completing missions and finding things in the world and things like that that will allow you to purchase new weapons and weapon upgrades and that sort of thing in order to be better equipped for the mission at hand. You can mark targets to keep track of them. You are given relative freedom to approach the objectives from various different angles and find slightly different ways of completing those objectives. There's even points of interest scattered throughout the map, which will allow you to complete a very short climbing puzzle in order to find something, whether it be just extra parts or anything else. But trust me, it's gonna be extra parts for the crafting system. Hell, they even threw a rather rudimentary vehicle system into this thing, and it definitely feels rudimentary because the driving is very floaty and it actually ends up being kind of slow as well. Thing is, it's faster than running there because the movement speed when you're on foot is painfully slow. This kind of goes against the idea that if you're stuck in the middle of a firefight and you didn't really want to be in that firefight, then you can't really get away from it very easily either. It makes for quite a bit of frustration, as do the sniping mechanics, which aren't all that well told to the player. Sure, you have a distance meter that you can use to say, oh well, this is going to require a certain amount of drops, so let's just eyeball it here. But you don't really get any real indication of which way the wind's blowing and how hard the wind is blowing, because that's kind of important, because this game does simulate ballistics. Granted, it's only for the sniper rifles. If you're using the assault rifles or the pistols, then that's all hit scan, but the sniper rifles are ballistic. In theory, this adds quite a bit of depth to the sniping mechanic. In reality, it becomes more irritating than anything else because you don't really have a very good indication of where your shot's going to land just based on the visual cues around you. Maybe there was some visual cue I was missing, but it was rather frequent that I would take a shot and it would either go just under or just above and just to the left or just to the right of where I was wanting it to go. But the thing is, it was almost never the elevation and almost exclusively the windage. So there needs to be better visual cues for the sniping mechanics, particularly if you're going to be making some really long range shots, which you pretty much weren't able to do in this particular beta, but which I imagine will probably be in the full game. And if those kind of changes were made to give us better visual feedback on where our shot is going to land, without necessarily explicitly telling us where it's going to land, then the sniping mechanic would go from a good idea but poor execution to a good idea and decent execution. But that would still leave the overall gameplay being pretty much just a pathetic excuse of a Far Cry clone, and it ends up being something where you go, wait, why was this even a thing? thing. Not a single game in this series has been good so far. What makes them think that taking it open world is going to fix that magically? Because it seems like that's pretty much what they did here. They said, you know what, all these other games are going open world, let's go ahead and make this open world, and that'll be all we really need to do to make this thing work. And that's nowhere near enough. This thing is only a demo, and even then it still feels incredibly sparse. The only real purpose for the open world is to give you different angles of attack. Well, if they're gonna do that, then they might as well just make it so you have a bunch of different levels, and then you can go into them from different spawn points. But instead of doing something like that, they basically just looked at current trends and said, screw it, we're gonna make it an open world game, and it does not benefit from the open world at all. It does benefit from the more open-ended level design to a very slight degree, because that at least gives you some flexibility with how you can attack an objective. But the space in between those missions? No. We've seen a lot of open world games over the past several years, and even the ones that don't handle their open worlds very well and just throw in a bunch of random crap to do, still handle their open worlds better than this. Because at least in those games, there's something in the in-between spaces. Here, there's just nothing. And I think that's going to be what ultimately drags this thing down to the depths, because if you don't have anything in your big open world other than a few missions to complete and a few things to climb on, then there's not really much point to having your open world in the first place. And that's on top of the rather significant technical problems, the rather dumb AI, and the really uninspired mission design itself. Not to mention that perfect storm of FOV, motion blur, and lens effects that makes this thing absolutely puke-inducing. I will be unbelievably impressed if they manage to somehow salvage this thing, but given City Interactive's track record, I don't expect it to get too much better than this. But we'll just have to wait and see. Maybe they'll surprise us. Thanks for watching.